I have the pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for the session on Latin America and the Caribbean. So I have the pleasure to introduce you to Simone Zecchini. He's a social development policy professional with 2 decades of experience in international organizations, and he's currently acting as the officer in charge of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean's Social Development Division. Simone, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Jost. Pasamos al español.
Thank you very much, George. We're now going to be speaking Spanish. Welcome you all to this session on the insights, the social protection responses to COVID-19 in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have interpretation, so you can use that function. Latin America and the Caribbean has become one of the most affected regions, most affected by COVID, both in terms of people who have been infected and people who have died. This is related to the structural problems of the region, inequality, and of course, the lack of protection. How are we, as a result of this pandemic, the region will have the worst economic crisis in the last 100 years, an increase in unemployment, and of course, an increase in poverty. However, countries have reacted. There are many actions of social protection, and these countries are here to share and learn from all these experiences. In this panel, we will have the following structure. First, we will hear 2 researchers from the International Policy Center for Improve and Development, Ana Carolina Machado and Nurse Palomo. They will be speaking about the social protection measures that have been adopted in the region. After that, we will have a panel, a country to country, with 4 experiences of countries, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Guatemala. We will have the government authorities who are working every day on the response of their countries to the pandemic, and we'd like to thank them for their time to be with us to share their experience. They will be speaking about the context of social protection before COVID-19, the responses, the meaning of broadening the registry of the households and the results of this. So I'd like to remind you that this session is being recorded. I'd like to remind you that you can send your questions and at the end, we will have a question and answer period. I'm going to be very grateful to those who will be presenting to the speakers to please keep to their time. Ana Carolina and North, and then for the presentation of countries in 12 minutes, I will have the unpleasant role of letting you know that the time is over. To remind the speakers, because they can then share with all those who are participating in this conference. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Ana Carolina and to Nurse for the regional presentation. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Simón, por esta introducción. Creo que voy a hablar en inglés. Peço perdón. I speak in English, and so basically I will present today the role, what IPC has been doing in the mapping of social protection measures. And I just need again to ask, oh, thank you, ask the requests remote control. Was not working before, I'm sorry for that. Okay, should work now. So basically what we are basing our analysis today is on a very extensive mapping of social protection responses that has been built by IPC, with the support from experts and consultants that are also working with the SPACE team. And also it's built on other existing mappings, such as the one from even CEPAL, also ILO, and the World Bank, which links will be soon available for you in the chat. So we based our work on also other resources, governance or feature reporters, also news. And this is actually an effort that covers the global south, so not only Latin America and the Caribbean, but also other regions. And special thanks, that the work was prepared in support with the UNDP and GIZ. And special thanks for the IPCAG team who worked with us in the mapping of Latin American measures, and also UNICEF Regional Office for Latin American Caribbean colleagues who were the partners for the development of 2 technical notes. That links will also be available for you to, on the chat. So based on the structure analysis of the shock response to social protection, we'll be focusing on 4 dimensions on today's presentation. We saw them before in the introduction of this conference. So I will be talking about coverage, comprehensiveness, adequacy, and also the delivery chain of both social assistance, social insurance, and labor markets. And actually my colleague, Nur Paloma, who is also online, will take over soon with the social assistance focus. While I cover more social insurance and labor markets. When it comes to the geographic coverage, we have 26 very diverse countries in our list. And you see that from the region, it covers both higher income, upper middle income, and low and lower middle income countries. And needless to say that our region, Latin America, is the most affected by COVID. In fact, we have today 9.2 million cases. This is by the end of August, 28% of all cases in the world, and 34% of the whole of the deaths in the world, which is very large, consider that the populations of Latin America is only 8.5% of the world's total, and a decrease in GDP projected by 9.1%. And what I wanted to keep in mind is that these both health and economic consequences of the crisis reach the region in an already quite complicated situation, not just in the economic side, but also in the social protection side. If you see the coverage levels of social protection, and most specifically social insurance, less actually than 40% of active workers are contributed to social security, while in terms of social assistance, we only have around 20% of households receiving some sort of conditional cash transfers. So basically, when you look into that, it's not, oops, next slide. Well, while it's passing, you see that actually Latin America is not lagging behind in terms of responses. We mapped around 162 social protection responses. This includes both new programs and also adjustments for existing ones. We focus on government measures, so not including humanitarian responses. Most of them, as we see, are social assistance, 60%, while 40% represent social insurance and labor markets. In terms of number of measures, we see from this map, it's a heat map, that Peru is kind of the lead in South America in terms of number of responses. In Central America, we have highlights for Guatemala, although I have to say here also that just a higher number of measures does not actually reflect the comprehensiveness of the responses, neither the adequacy or even the coverage, which I will be exploring in the next slides. When you think on how extensive are those measures, we see that most countries actually responded with social assistance and especially cash transfers, as I said, or either using new ones, especially covering those that were not yet benefited by social protection as informal workers, and with a kind of predominance of in-kind transfers, especially for lower income countries. Also highlights goals for school feeding programs adaptations, for which also we have special resources for you that will be available on the chat. When you look into labor market and social insurance, the blue columns, you see that the most extensive responses were in terms of wage subsidies, which I'll be focusing on the next slides, but also we had other mechanisms, and as I will just pass. So, as you see, this also includes subsidized credit for payroll, also includes or either cash support directly to companies to keep business, and adjustments in other mechanisms such as unemployment schemes, also lowering or deferring of social security contributions, and finally the adjustments of severance funds. The most important to keep in mind is that all those measures, they were focused on the purpose of protecting the wage of those workers who lost their jobs or had the contracts reduced due to the measures of social distancing. And actually there were 3 main, as we see from this slide, there were 3 main types of interventions. At least 18 countries took them, so you can see that they are very diverse. Actually, this slide is an effort to put them all together. We can mention the direct cash transfers for formal workers who lost their incomes as one of them. Also, changes in the design of the unemployment schemes and severance funds, as it was the case, for example, in Chile, or the direct payroll subsidies for companies, as it happened in Argentina and Colombia. In terms of benefit levels, what I also have to say is that benefit levels, they could be variable. Actually, in most cases, they were variable, which means that they were basically based on the previous level of the salaries, or actually depending on the percentage of the reduction of the contracts of employees. So highlights goes here for Dominican Republic, that's managed to cover, on this graph, you can see a comparison between the benefit levels and the coverage, benefit levels being the orange and coverage being the blue. And as you can see, a good match of on Dominican Republic for the efforts of announcing a coverage of even half of the working age of the labor force, with a benefit average covering at least half of the average wage. But in fact, what we see is a tendency that the higher benefits, as you can see here, again, from the higher coverage, as you can see here, again, from the blue bars, are actually tending to have lower benefit levels, and the opposite is also true. So higher benefit levels tending to benefit less of a proportion of the labor force. So with this message, I invite you all to check the mapping as soon as it's available. The idea is to make it available by the end of the year. And I will pass now to my colleague Nur Palomo, who will talk about the social assistance measures. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to present the social assistance responses in the region with a special focus on cash transfers. You will see next the main social protection components and instruments. Let me start by saying that in Latin America, only around 39% of vulnerable groups are covered by a non-contributory cash transfer. That could explain why emergency cash transfers were widely used in the region. As you can see on the graph, 40 emergency cash transfers were created. We identified that at least 17 countries adapted their school feeding programs to continue offering meals to students and their families. We also observed that 14 unconditional cash transfers that target segments of the population with current or some social protection, social pensions for the elderly. You can also see that countries also implemented in-kind transfer subsidies like taxes and energy discounts, public measures that were part of the response as well. I will share next some of the highlights of the social response to COVID-19 in Latin America. In the region, 21 countries used their existing schemes to implement nearly 60 measures. Some of the adaptations include waiving of conditionalities, changes in the capacity and delivery mechanisms. At least 14 countries created programs to include informal workers. We also saw some linkages across components. Regarding existing programs, we identified horizontal expansions in at least 3 countries. Brazil included almost 1.3 million of new beneficiaries to Bolsa Familia, and some governments announced more beneficiaries to their social payments program, Colombia and Costa Rica. And just to finish this part, in terms of vertical expansion, at least 10 countries granted additional amounts and advanced payments to beneficiaries. Regarding changes in coverage, significant expansions were made in more than 20 countries that created emergency cash transfers, especially to include that group that were not covered before. The missing middle that someone talked about before. We tried to show you in blue the population announced by governments and the population covered in green. This should not necessarily be interpreted as the government completed their program, because this depends on the frequency and duration. So it is difficult to precisely say what programs are still ongoing, but we can see here that some countries completed their programs with one-off payments. If you look at the graph, you will see the coverage ranges from 2% to 77% of the country's total population. Guatemala, and it is in the top with Bono Familia that covered 77% of the population. Peru with 4 programs also cover almost 75% of the population. And when reviewing the programs, you can see the duration varies among countries. 14 programs delivered just one-off payments, and others distributed the benefits during several months. For example, 9 months in Brazil and Colombia. However, in terms of adequacy, you will see next some other changes. Regarding adequacy changes, this graph shows you some emergency cash transfers to observe the benefit as percentage of family monthly income. We presented in red the amount covered $2 in PPP for better comparison. And in green, you can see the percentage as the average family income. And in blue, the percentage as the income of the poorest quintile to see what transfers represents for these 2 groups. Take a look at the graph, and you will see Peru and Colombia are examples of huge differences of the benefits between the poorest quintile and average family income. And as you can note, none of the countries offer amounts of more than 27% of their average family income. In terms of generosity, some seems to be more generous, like Bono Universal in Peru, or Quédate en Casa in Dominican Republic. But take a look at the numbers between brackets that corresponds to the frequency. And this is something to consider for giving precisely analysis on this regard. We will see more details of these programs in the following presentations with interesting cases like Brazil, Guatemala, and Colombia, and Chile. Now I will like to move on to the school feeding programs. When Talking about feeding programs, it is important to mention that they are currently benefit 85 million students in the region. So that's why they became the second most used strategy to overcome food insecurity during the COVID-19 crisis. 21 countries adopted diverse measures to continue to supply school meals. 17 countries implemented different delivery modalities like delivery food for consumption or preparation at home. And at least 3 countries changed the meals for cash transfers. Also regarding horizontal expansions, we identified at least 3 or 4 countries that added products to the food basket or increased money of their food cards. And in other countries like Colombia that were adopted mixing some of these modalities. I'm about to finish just sharing next some important information regarding delivery chain. I should mention that many of the new programs use the administrative tools of existing social programs, whether they're social databases, their methods of payments, or targeting mechanisms. And for registries, there were 3 methods. Using their social registries to select beneficiaries from the waiting list or graduated. And we identified around 9 countries, digital windows. Some countries created online platforms or mobile applications to enroll new beneficiaries. Other mechanisms like using different databases, local governments created beneficiary lists, or using energy accounts. And regarding payments, we actually saw innovative payment mechanisms that were created to swiftly transfer cash to affected people during the crisis. For beneficiaries with an account, it was easier. They received the transfer directly. We saw this in Brazil, Colombia. Beneficiaries without an account, they created or they offer 3 options. Having access to a mobile wallet, like happened in Colombia and Brazil. Using withdrawal options with a code. Beneficiaries can use the code in bank agencies or ATMs to receive the transfer. We saw this in Ecuador, Bono de Contingencia. The third is that receive the cash in hand in bank branches, showing
2 minutes.
only the IDs. One example of Paraguay with Programa Pitbull. And I'm about to close on final considerations. The crisis improved visibility to people who were not yet covered by social protection. Some workers and the families are missed out even from the most completed social protection systems in the region. The second, there are important challenges. Lack of basic services, limited fiscal space, financial constraints, and there are just some of them. But one of the most important is that it is clear vulnerable groups are still not covered. In the region, there are particularly 2 groups, the indigenous population and migrants that are very vulnerable. They have the highest level of informality and lack of access to services. As you all know, Latin America is in the midst of the largest migration crisis with the Venezuelan migrants. And they are particularly affected by the social economic consequences. And many do not have previous access to social protection and not to the responses. As a final message, well, the COVID-19 crisis represents an opportunity for governments to renovate their social protection systems. They can do it in a more innovative, inclusive, and sustainable way. In the region, we can see in some countries there are ongoing discussions on this regard, like in Argentina and Chile, and that's a really good sign. And with that being said, I conclude my presentation today. I'm sure you will enjoy the next panelists and their countries' experiences. And thanks for listening.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ana Carolina, for this very large overview. You gave us a very large overview of the social protection measures in Latin America and the Caribbean. I would emphasize some innovations, of course, the broadening of the cash transfers and the kind transfers, but also to mention the population that has been taken care of, because the Latin America and the Caribbean, the pandemic goes to the informal population, the people who fell in a non-protected area because they were not having the right to have the cash transfers, and also important problems in the system of registration or register. This had to change in a very innovative and new way. And also, of course, the innovation in the payment systems, because the idea regarding the cash transfer was not to create crowds of people because of the social distancing need. Of course, it is an overview, a very significant overview of what's happening, but of course, it's changing overnight. The dynamics, the countries uh, say that they're taking a measure that is going to take place once or twice.
Un mensaje, yo muy brevemente voy a hacer algunos comentarios.
A message, I would say, very briefly, I'm going to make some comments. I believe that this brings to the table the message of the need to have the universal social protection systems in the countries to encourage development process, and also to face this and successive crises. The countries themselves in the region came to agree on this a year ago in Mexico. Latin American and Caribbean countries in the Regional Conference on Social Development adopted the regional agenda for inclusive social development in order to implement the 2030 program or agenda. And there are 4 axes that are very important. One of them, social protection, strengthening social institutionalization and cooperation, something we are doing nowadays. The second thing I'd like to mention is that we have seen in the presentation of our 2 colleagues a broadening of the social protection measures. And also it's opening the way to discuss policies. We used to think that not many changes could be undertaken in social protection of countries. This has shown in very short term that it can increase the coverage of the population. And of course, we will have new and old debates to make universal, unconditional benefits. These are technical, political, ideological debates. The important thing is to think that the social protection measures that are being adopted by the countries are not unlinked from the development models in the countries and the look about development we have. We have the 2030 agenda and the approach of the rights, as I mentioned, regarding universal social protection. It includes that universalism sensitive to differences in a region that is characterized by so many socioeconomic inequalities because of sex, gender, age, ethnic. If we are trying to become universal in social protection, we must be aware of the fact that we have to adopt different measures vis-a-vis our heterogeneous situations. The eternal debate of focalization versus universalization from ECLAC, the Latin American Commission for Economics. They have emphasized the fact that we proposed an emergency social income, universal income measures that have to be under control, such as the package to access communication, and also those for the small and middle income companies to protect the worker. And this in the short term, but in the long term, we are insisting on the need to build a true welfare system in the region, the big promise that has not been complied with, and also to take into consideration the proposal of universal basic income that is included in the report on the impact of the pandemic in the region, has mentioned that the countries could take into account that measure that of course cannot be implemented overnight, but gradually taking into account the broadening of the cash wire transfer. So we've seen that there has been some significant responses of the countries, and now we're going to hear directly the representatives of these countries. They will have 12 minutes for their presentation. We will begin with Brazil. In Brazil, it is an honor, pleasure to have Fabiana Rodopoulos with us. She is the National Secretary of Citizenship. As you know, this is the state agency that takes care of the cash transfer of Bolsa Familia. So Fabiana, you have the floor with your presentation based on the experience of Brazil. Thank you very much.
Todos. Empiezo mi presentación juntamente con Nilza, the national, sorry, I'll speak in English. I will share this presentation with Nilza, the National Secretary of the Single Registry, that in Brazil is responsible for this new emergency aid that we are doing. So we can start with Nilza, and then I can talk a little bit later. Nilza, the floor is yours.
Okay, so we are here to share thank you very much for everybody. We are here to share the Brazilian experience and the social protection during the pandemic, focus on the emergency aid. So I'm going to show you some slides. This is the Brazilian emergency aid, and we had this unprecedented initiative, and the law is from April 2020. It's the biggest income transfer in Brazilian history, and we had as eligible people 67.7 million. And in terms, it reached around 117 million people, which is like 56% of the Brazilian population. This is one of the main initiatives of the crisis. And to operate this, the operation was organized in a very short time. And first payments, for instance, were made in 6 days just after the approval of the EA law. The challenges, as the size of Brazil, are various. So many actors from 3 levels of government. We had public databases, but they were created for other purpose. And local facilities at that moment were social assistance were closed. So here is some characteristics of our emergency aid. High benefit value, around $110. And for the Bolsa Familia program, the families receive the emergency aid if the value is higher than the regular Bolsa Familia benefit. So 95% of the Bolsa Familia families start receiving EA. And we use technology to reach invisible people. So through an APP, we registered around 38 million people, and who were not included in the single registry system at that moment. So we were able to identify workers of the informal labor market, and it was unprecedented inclusion of the population and the banking system. These are the eligibility criteria that were listed on the law. I'm not going to pass through all of them because we have quite other information to share, but we had some limits related to wage, related to having an active formal job, not receiving benefits, public benefits, and a limit of monthly income per person, and total monthly income too. And so the next part, this presentation will be available, so you could check and some other details. So here is the amount that we were able to reach with the emergency aid. The eligible people represents 32% of Brazilian population, and as you could see in this graphic, you could take a look that 38 million were at the moment invisible to us in terms of the registry that we had, the Cadastro Único. So continuing, here is just how is the emergency aid covers the whole country. And of course, there is a relation between the amount of population where in Southeast, as São Paulo and Rio, we have more population, so more people are having access to the emergency aid, and in the Northeast also because we have the public that it's aimed to the social assistance. And the next here is just in terms of focalization. We had this Institute of Statistics in Brazil, and they released PNAD COVID-19. So this graphic shows that the families with the lowest income are the majority receiving the emergency aid, around 80% of the poorest families, 85% and 74%. The next one is also just to aim that focalization. The emergency aid is very focused, and in terms of focalization, it only stays behind Bolsa Familia program in Brazil. Here we go. This is the number of, I guess there is a change here of the slides because I need to show you the innovations of the extension of the emergency aid. I'm so sorry because I guess this slide had been out of this presentation, but I can tell you. Okay, so after 4 months, after 5 months with the emergency aid, we had the government take a look at the health situation again, and also the economy, and considering this, took the measure 1000 in September. So there was, the decision was to extend for 4 more months the payment of the emergency aid. But with some innovations. So the value of the benefit was reduced to half. And also there was a limit of 4 quotas, and the person would not have they only have the right for the extension when the last payment is finished. So that's why you have people that will receive 4 quotas, and there were other people, depending on the last month of payment, will receive 3, 2, or 1. Well, and here I would like to send to pass to Fabiana. She will continue from here. And after all, I thank everybody for the opportunity to share. Thank you.
So from now on, is we are talking about this extension of the emergency aid from August to December. So the government decided that it's still important to maintain the social protection for these people. The amount is in the beginning was 60 reais, 600 reais, and then from August to December we reduced to 300 reais. And the beneficiary, so in September, the beneficiary from these invisible ones that we discover from this emergency aid, like 27 million people, it's the amount of money is 9 billion. It's around 1.6 billion. And from these beneficiaries from Bolsa Familia, it's 16.3 million people, 4.3 billion reais. And we also, all the people that was under Bolsa Familia returned to the program, and we paid up to the 300 reais, because the benefit level is about around 191 reais. So we are just going to pay like the amount up to 300 reais to this beneficiary from Bolsa Familia. So the important thing to talk about this extension of emergency aid, that it is still important to have this social protection for these people. Of course, we have fiscal restraints, so we diminish the amount of money that we have. The coverage is around the same, from 67 from 61 million people that is covered for this extension of emergency aid. And we decided, yes, sure. Sorry. Oh, okay, 2 minutes. Okay. So next, please, Nilsa, can we go to the next slide? Okay. I'm going just to show that the Bolsa Familia program that we have before the crisis, it's started in December 2003 with 3.6 million people, and now we have 4.2 million people in Bolsa Familia. Yeah, just to show the evolution and numbers of these beneficiary families throughout these years. So this is the most famous one, the conditional cash transfers for families, focus on the poverty and the eligibility line, especially regarding in health and education areas. Next, please. And this is before emergency aid, we have 14, in the beginning of the April, we include 1.2 million in Bolsa Familia. So we have the amount of 14.274 people's families in Bolsa Familia. So in almost 4,734 municipalities. And now almost 95% of Bolsa Familia family moved to the emergency aid because it's more advantage, because in Bolsa Familia the average is 191, and in the beginning of the emergency aid 600 reais. So they moved to this emergency aid, like 41 people receiving emergency aid, 30 and the total amount per month 15 billions. Next, please. This is just to show you what is Bolsa Familia program with the structure of the benefits. So we have basic benefits, variable benefits focus on the youth, and the eligibility lines, not like for the focalization, the extreme poverty, like 89 reais, around $16, and the poverty 178 reais, around $32. So we just show what is the evolution and the amount of loan that is readjusted from 2003 to 2018. Next, please. The evolution of the average benefit value of Bolsa Familia, like 72 in the beginning and 191 before the emergency aid. So as you can see, much lower than our emergency aid that we have in the beginning to track the COVID. Next, please. And this is the extension of emergency aid that goes through 300 reais, around 54 reais, limited up to 2/4 of 300 per family. So the benefit of Bolsa Familia is complemented up to 300 reais, as I told you. And this is the last slide, just to show you. We have in Brazil a challenge for Bolsa Familia family for the next for the next year. How to address these new invisibles and in these people that we now can show, and they need to some support, because they have still they don't have jobs, and still is under the protection safety. And on the other hand, we have of course, fiscal restraints. So we are now challenging how to address in Bolsa Familia program, or the new version of Bolsa Familia, that can address these lessons that we've learned from emergency aid. How can came into the program of course, on focalization program that Bolsa Familia is well known in the international experience. But of course, we have fiscal restraints. So it's now in Brazil the discussion on the Congress how to address this. We are working on a constitutional amendment so that Bolsa Familia can be protected. And the difficult part that is still ongoing in Brazil is how to financiate this new program and the broad of the program. So we are thinking to maintain this 300 reais, that is the second phase of emergency aid, and which other ways to finance this new program, facing the new reality that Brazil is doing right now. Just thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you and show the experience of Brazil. It was like we are working on 24 hours a day for put this program in 6 days after the publication of the law in Brazil, and we're still working hard to support this emergency aid and the new program for the next year.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabiana. And also, thank you, Nilsa Yamasaki, because...
Gracias a Fabiana, gracias a Nilsa Yamasaki. because the other spine of the system of social protection is the only case that is the focalization. Thank you both for your excellent presentations. They show us the progress made in Brazil. You've been working, and also the next person who will be making a presentation, the Undersecretary of Social Assessment in the Ministry of Social Development and Family, Alejandra Candia. I can tell you firsthand, because I have worked with her, that they have worked tirelessly to make sure that the transfer should reach the family. So Alejandra, please, you have 12 minutes. Thank you very much, Simone. Thank you all for the invitation and the opportunity you give us to tell you how we have faced the big challenge, this pandemic, because of its not only health impact, but also from all points of view, socioeconomic impact. I don't know very well how to, now I can do it. As you know, the pandemic for all the countries that are now being represented, we are quite aware of the fact that the pandemic that the whole world is facing today, sooner or later, is a pandemic that, of course, has a root in health. It has effects and ha generado un gran impacto a nivel global en esta pérdida de it has made a big shock at the world level in the case of unemployment and the life quality consequences. So we have devoted our efforts to create a network of social protection to protect the income because of the health situation we're facing, as Simone has said, and to create partnerships such as the 2030 Agenda. The society has included the academia, international organizations to be able to face this in the best possible manner. We like to tell you that we had a survey of national representativity to understand the socioeconomic effects of COVID in our country. And as you can see here, according to these results, close to half of the households said they decreased their income, and half or more than half. In the next one, we are showing you. Acá se ve que los hogares you que can see that the households that stated that they don't have enough income before and during the pandemic, there is an increase from 16.5 to almost half, 48%, saying that you don't have enough income. And as you can see in this slide, the socioeconomic reality, 2 out of 3 households say that they don't have enough income. Also, households that are the head of the household is a woman, and it's very important in the recovery in the last period that was analyzed. But at any rate, mainly in the households in our country, we can see that there are some households that there is nobody who has a job during the pandemic. As we said, 4 out of every 10 households in the first centiles of income, and in 1/3 where the head of the household is a woman, don't have any income. As Simone told you, we have been working very hard to bear in mind that considering the health reality, because of course this will have to be a fine tuning to be able to see the evolution of the health crisis, the relationship with the income crisis. We have created a network of social protection that takes into account the reality of our country. I don't know whether you know the details. There is a network that is pointing to different income realities in our country, and they have been able to have access to the job protection law, and not only to increase their income, but to have the labor protection where the pandemic has forced the health risk to have protection. The same, the benefit to self-employed people, and also subsidies to employment. But we are aware of the fact that there is a lack of economic protection in households with a large amount of income or of informal income. This led us to start working on to be able to design what is the emergency family income. This is an income that looks at protecting mainly the income of the households that are self-employed, or they have not been able to go out to work, an income that was paid late May. At the beginning, it was only for 4 months, but in spite of that, there was a downfall because in our country, the urban areas are out of confinement, and some regions have followed this. So the income, emergency income is being decreased according to the law for the protection of employment to be able to go together with a plan that is challenging regarding the contract of people to have a job, workers who were under the employment protection law, and also for those who were in the trade unions. So another very relevant aspect in our country is that
todos los esfuerzos que se han hecho han estado cruzados por los distintos ODS y
this is by the different SDGs, and so that our country follows the 2030 agenda as a strong tool as a leader in order to face this pandemic. And we can see that we are now in a stage where we went from the diagnosis to different reports. Last year, it was submitted to the UN, and now we are in a situation where we have to start the implementation of the agenda. And we as a country are pointing at what we have called a sustainable recovery, where the central axis is in the health system is to be able to protect the health of every person. But for that, we also have to absolute awareness of revenue protection, and as much as possible and simultaneously, the economic reactivation and job reactivation. We see this in the different tools with which we have been working, not only from the state, but in coordination as SDGs state, by the private sector, by academicians, by the government, for the design, assessment, and implementation, and as we have called the fine-tuning of the health objectives and the socioeconomic objectives in order to to deal with the situation in the best way possible in order to benefit all persons, especially the most vulnerable persons. This is all. I went very quickly through all of the slides, but afterwards we will be able to talk in more detail about some of the aspects of that our country has done in terms of socioeconomic matters in order to face the huge challenge that the pandemic has presented not only to our country but to the world. Thank you very much for your invitation.
Muchísimas gracias a ti, Alejandra. De verdad, un panorama muy
Thank you
completo.
very much, Alejandra. This has been a very comprehensive look, and we are happy to hear the very significant message regarding economy and health. They have to go hand in hand, because if we cannot control the pandemic, it is impossible to reactivate the economy. We have to give support to those families that have lost their income, and you gave us very concrete information about what has been done in Chile. Now we're going to go to the next presentation by Laura Pavón. She is the head of social development of the Department of the National Department of Planning in Colombia. Colombia, a country that from the very beginning of the pandemic
ya ha sido uno de los primeros en extenderlas en el tiempo.
And they have expanding the time after recognizing how severe is the crisis. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Simone. Good morning. It is a great pleasure to participate here and to share with you the responses of Colombia to face the risks derived from this pandemic. I'd like to begin by mentioning a very important thing. It is one crisis from which we have learned lessons. So that is the 1999 crisis that had a very big impact on the low-income population. We found that families had resorted to strategies that went against their health, in decrease in food input. They took their children away from school. And so we created the network of social support that gave action in order to protect the health and welfare. And there were two laws. What were the main measures that Colombia undertook to face the pandemic? First, as was mentioned in other presentations, we began by sending some cash, additional extraordinary transfers in the three big programs of conditioned cash transfers, families in actions, young people in action, and Colombia Mayor. We added extraordinary payments, additional payments to the ones that people are already receiving. The other measures that you also mentioned have to do with nutrition and food bags that were distributed, and going first to infants and children, and also for the elderly. One of the most important measures that we took was the creation of a new program, Ingreso Solidario. This was had been created before, but had been programmed to start with the lower coverage. This has a goal to mitigate the indirect tax on.
Es un programa de transferencias monetarias no condicionadas.
This is called Ingreso Solidario. It is the first program of cash transfers, unconditioned, created to mitigate the impacts of the emergency of COVID-19. It is aimed at those households that do not belong to families in action. We are including those that do not get any transfer from any other program. They are unprotected to face the risks of the pandemic. The program includes 9 payments. It began in April and it will go up to December to 2020 and has been extended to 2021 because we know there will be a recovery period. The way that where we have done it is done through the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit during the first stage in terms of focalization of providing unconditioned cash transfers and also a scheme of digital dispersion payment, not having people going to the bank. And this has created several challenges.
Tal como nos pasó, al igual que en Brasil, pues este es un programa de respuesta rápida. Sabíamos.
As the case in Brazil, this is a rapid response program. We knew of the problems that we have seen in the past if we did not respond rapidly. So we designed the program in 2 weeks and 4 days. We've been for 5 months operating this program. The program was designed by us together.
Y cuando el programa ya estaba bien consolidado,
we began with it in the first part, and then we made the transfer to the Department of Social Prosperity for them to continue operating this and to improve some of the aspects, because after 4 months of operating it, we had some challenges we had to overcome. This was with Families in Action, together with families, the program Families in Action, to reach 2.6 million people in 5 months. We have reached 3 million households, and this is one of the lessons we have learned from the pandemic, and also focalization. Because of time, I will not be speaking about that in detail, but in Colombia, our instrument is System. We have the 3rd version of System now, and we are doing the work to go in the 4th stage of this. We had to accelerate things for some of the actions to be undertaken, because one of the great commitments, it's the implementation of social registry. In that sense, we had to create a master database that is the first version of the social registry, including all the social information, updated information, and also the version of the System 3, so that we should have a comprehensive, a complete database, not to leave anybody outside. And we, of course, used other social registries to identify the population who are in poverty and vulnerability, who need the help and the aid. We had to face other challenges regarding operations. This is the way we have organized payment processes. This is also a very significant challenge. We have organized each payment in cycles, and we
para llegar a la no bancarizada, nosotros tuvimos que
one is not through banks. For the banking stage, we had to work with workers in mobile so that they would send messages, text messages, and to download some products. And we had to do all the validation process. It was a very challenging process, and so that it would be safe, quick, without having people go outside their home. And then also that coverage, not all the agencies have a presence in all the municipalities. So we had to work on that in order to cover all the population. This is part of the strategies. I will not speak about the cost. It's significant that 65% of beneficiaries are women
en pobreza extrema el 40%.
in this
Tenemos
program of Ingreso Solidario. We have another program that we also launched that is the rebate of the value-added tax. There were some challenges in terms of the banking system of some of the households that were not part of the financial system. These are aids that allowed us to reach almost 4 million households that have been receiving the benefits of the new aid. These are by monthly payment. It's a lower payment. It's to compensate that tax. And we have some accomplishments in some sections. As a country, we implemented for the first time the cash transfers that are unconditioned, and also in financial inclusion, where we accomplished some things. 1 million households have access for the first time to financial products, and there was the empowerment of the women. It was mainly for women, 65% of the beneficiaries. And in terms of tools, we had to implement a social registry of households that we have used in order to look for the focalization of Ingreso Solidario. This is what we have. We have the first databases, that is the master database, and then plus the administrative registries and the SISPEM. We can now have a better tool, and this will be something we have learned because of the crisis. We have to improve our tools for focalization. In generally speaking, regarding the results, before the crisis, the cash transfers reached 38% of households that were more vulnerable. After the crisis, we are reaching 89% of the households that are in the conditions of poverty and economic vulnerability. Regarding the GDP before COVID, this was now it's 0.74%. I'd just like to mention some of the results that we have identified in several studies. World Bank and Development Bank, the poverty in Colombia could be increased between 6.4 or to 10.9 percentage points. Presently, it's 27% of the population is in poverty conditions. What we have found in these studies is that the measures implemented we're only considering the monetary or the cash transfers, but cash transfers have helped mitigate up the increase in poverty, and that will be the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Laura. You had to go fast. You've done a lot, and as you said, some things were done for the first time regarding the unconditioned transfers. That it's another country that has closed down the schools and is facing problems because of that.
Thank you so much, Laura. And now we will go to the Minister of Social Development from Guatemala, Mr. Raul Romero. Guatemala is a country that we all know has extreme poverty and poverty levels that are somewhat above the countries that we have with whom we have talked to, and they have tax levels and spending levels and social spending that is lower as well. But they have acted in this situation. Mr. Minister, you all have also 12 minutes The interpreters have asked me not to speak so fast, so please go ahead. Good morning to everyone. I am glad to greet you. Greetings from Guatemala. Yes, indeed, you have a presentation. We will try to summarize in 12 minutes the context in which the social protection has occurred in Guatemala. More specifically, I'd like to concentrate on the decisions that have been made within the COVID-19 crisis. Guatemala is one of the countries that has, I would say, lagged more behind in terms of social protection. You might be aware that in 2001, 12, 8, we have the social development law, and it is in 2008 where some social programs start to emerge, spread out, and detached. They did not have the right focalization, they did not have mechanisms to measure impacts, and somehow they were not generating comprehensiveness in social protection. It is until 2012 where we have the creation of the Ministry of Social Development. It is in charge of the promotion of policies, in charge of generating actions and programs that will enable the most vulnerable sectors in terms of poverty and extreme poverty to move forward. Some indicators have shown that this has not been achieved. Poverty in general in Guatemala has gone up 8.3 percentage points from 2006 to 2014, and extreme poverty went up an additional 8.2 percentage points. There was no reduction in the levels of poverty, but rather they continued to grow. With regards to social protection, public spending in Guatemala is of 7% compared to the GDP, when the average in Latin America, as we all are aware, is at least of 11%, meaning that if we see this from the viewpoint, from the financial viewpoint, it has not been reflected in the revenue and spending budgets of the country. It has not been reflected as a priority. This social protection has not been a priority. We are all aware that states must, policies must be reflected in their budget. In this context, which has been an extremely difficult context that has not allowed social protection in Guatemala to reach the goals that it has intended, on January the 14th this year, we face a global crisis, basically. I think that it is important to mention two things here. As a conclusion of this first context, until 2020, we can say that there are two aspects that are expressing the situation in Guatemala. We have had a ministry of social development, and we have had a ministry of social welfare with programs that are essentially of assistance. And we have not even, or we had not taken even the first steps for the creation of a comprehensive social protection system. This is how we now reach the COVID-19 crisis, where President Alejandro Yamatei, who has established 10 different social programs. Why 10 different social programs? Because the idea is that each one of the social programs could have inclusion and exclusion criteria that will provide coverage to different segments of the population, taking into account that in Guatemala, the social fabric has different characteristics and compositions. At no time was it the purpose for one single social program to cover 100% of the persons affected by the COVID-19 crisis. But one first strategic decision was made, and this was to identify specific programs for different segments of the population with specific characteristics. The Ministry of Social Development of the 10 programs was in charge of leading or designing and leading 3 of them. The first one was the bonus for family economy, and this has been to support those persons that have no access to a formal job and that are sellers in like street vendors, and this is to support their families. The second has been a program to provide food. We are carrying out, thanks to the WPA, and Guatemala is purchasing food for amounts without any precedent. We are buying 700 million in vegetables, and this has had an impact in over 1 million beneficiaries. And This was designed so that one family with 5 adult members, which in Guatemala the average is of 4.8 persons, can eat for 30 days. And the characteristics are some technical characteristics that guarantee that this will also contribute to fight against malnutrition. And the other social program that has generated more expectations in Guatemala out of the 10 social programs and that has been also in charge of the Social Development Ministry is the Bono Familia, family bonus. It has some specific characteristics. I'd like to tell you that, first of all, Bono Familia emerges after a decree in Congress. This is Decree 13220 that sets forth the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. The executive body regulates through regulations the execution of the program by respecting the criteria that have been established. In this sense, one of the first aspects is that we define that the universe of beneficiaries will be those families or persons that have access to electricity and that have a consumption below 200 kilowatts, which in Guatemala is the social rate, meaning that this already defined a social profile of who could be the beneficiaries of the program. This was only the first step for access to be eligible for Bono Familia. A platform was created. It is very new because this is achieved by means of a partnership with different state institutions and private institutions in order to build capacities, installed capacities with which the state of Guatemala and the Ministry of Development did not have. I'd like to make a parenthesis. Prior to the COVID-19 crisis, the list of beneficiaries in the Ministry of Social Development in Guatemala with all of its different programs did not exceed 300,000 beneficiaries. But now, 6 months later, the list of beneficiaries of the Ministry of Social Development is close to 4 million beneficiaries, meaning that we made a quantum leap and qualitative leap. Quantitative because we threefolded or fivefolded the list of beneficiaries of the regular programs of the Ministry of Social Development with the 3 COVID-19 programs. Besides that, the amount that is being spent currently is equal to the budget for 6 years of the ministry. We are spending it in less than 1 year. Bono Familia has followed these technical criteria that enable us, first of all, to target persons with a consumption of under 200 kilowatts. They have the possibility to register. Then we cross-check information to see that they are not included in the exclusion criteria, which were they should not be state workers, they could not be retirees with pensions above 2,000 quetzales, they could not be beneficiaries if they were already receiving benefits or assistance from any other social program. This in order not to duplicate the assistance. After that, we basically have an enrollment of close to 2.5 million beneficiaries and close to 91,000 households attempted to be beneficiaries of Bono Familia. But once we cross-checked the information, we found that some of them were already contained in some of the exclusion criteria. We feel extremely satisfied because this has enabled us to avoid something that was questioned historically regarding social programs in Guatemala. The list of beneficiaries or the roster of beneficiaries had been used politically with political purposes. The central government used to select previously who could be eligible to these programs. And with the elements that I just described, which are eminently technical elements, it is not possible for the central government or an official or a state agency to define who is or who cannot be eligible. In the case of Guatemala, there are 3 private companies that are issuing the distribution invoices and 16 municipal companies, meaning that the roster of beneficiaries for Bono Familia emerges from them. And here I'd like to mention 3 important things. The universe of beneficiaries of the total in Guatemala, which is of 3.3 million persons that have access to electricity, 388,000 do not have access to electricity. And of these households, 2.6 million, meaning 79% of them, are currently beneficiaries of Bono Familia. And Besides, the decree sets forth that one can take up to 10% in some special cases of those households with no access to electricity. This is important because this means that Bono Familia will be reaching the poorest of the poor. This is the population segment which historically has been forgotten and neglected from social protection in our country. This is relevant because Bono Familia, beyond the assistance it provides at these times of crisis, is placing on the table a historically neglected social segment, which we believe is very important. You have 2 minutes left. The next one, please. And something important here is to mention that this program has been executed based on strategic partnerships. There are now 11 banks which are part of the financial system in Guatemala that are taking part in the distribution of Bono Familia. Bono Familia reaches beneficiaries in 3 different ways. One, they get a message via a mobile phone where they get a token number. They can go to any agency of any bank, any branch of any bank near them to make a partial or total withdrawal. They can go to any ATM at the national level or to any shop with POS, meaning that the money will be transferred directly from the state accounts to the hands of beneficiaries. There is no participation of any official, and thus this benefits transparency. Besides, it greatly facilitates the way in which it is distributed, meaning that no agglomerations are created, no overcrowding, and it reaches, and they can do this in the way that is easiest for them. This is something that had never occurred in Guatemala. This is the first time we do it, and this is thanks to a public-private partnership that shows that with minimum efforts, the economic sectors, political and social sectors, striving for the benefits to benefit the most needy population can achieve important things. Another element that I believe would be important to state besides beyond the coverage that we have qualitatively is that Bono Familia is opening the door to, number one, the emergence of second generation programs in Guatemala that will enable us to show that with technical criteria, we can establish beneficiary lists that are truly transparent, but also by using state-of-the-art technology, these benefits can reach transparently, avoiding corruption. And this is one of the things that has been a characteristic of social programs, especially in the case of Guatemala. And second, we are convinced now that Guatemala is taking the first steps in order to have not only a true Ministry of Development, but also to take the first steps for the creation of a social protection system that will give credibility to the participation of the state in terms of social protection, meaning that we will avoid spread out efforts where each one of the distributors does whatever they believe is fine, and we are strengthening those relevant and they strengthen relevant areas. But now we have elements that will focalize the population segments that have been more affected in terms of poverty or extreme poverty. And we now have measuring instruments and focalization instruments that the state used not to have before. The next step is to create the mechanisms that will enable us to measure the impact of social programs on population. This is since January 14, we have been funding the ministries. The social protection systems should not be measured quantitatively due to the coverage capacity or protection amounts. They must be measured based on the percentage of population that are taken out of poverty or extreme poverty, generating better life conditions that will enable them to join the labor market or the national economy, and thus to improve living conditions of their families permanently. This is truly to head along the way of social protection. We believe that Guatemala has generated awareness and instruments that will enable us to take that second step. And with this, we will truly be starting to walk along a permanent and comprehensive development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I'm sorry I had to ask you to go fast. Thank you. We heard a very clear description of what is happening in Guatemala and about the innovations regarding the registry of the cash transfers, and that has been most enlightening. Now we have about 4 minutes left, and I'd like to ask the 4 representatives of the countries, I'd ask them and to answer just like in a Twitter, and answer in 1 minute or less. I'd like to ask you to tell us of all the things that we have gone through, what has been the main lesson learned, and 2, what is the main challenge? It's quite a general question, but I think that is useful so that we can speak about the lesson we have learned, and then the main challenge, how to continue. 1 minute per speaker. We will begin with Brazil. Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Simone. The lessons in Brazil about the emergency aid is, I guess, is that we need to improve our systems, or the databases, the capacity to create liaisons that could make us improve the social registry and the inclusion of the public that are really in need for the social assistance. And on the other hand, of course, not to forget that technology is really a tool for us to reach more people, but there are some other limits for this, especially for us if we consider the people that are need to be protected and doesn't have the access, like here the indigenous people and even the most vulnerable people that are on the streets and so on. So we need to reflect. We need to take some more time to reflect, and of course to include all these lessons to the future of the programs. I don't know if Fabiana wants to add something to.
Yeah, that's the point. We are just discussing in Brazil how to do the social protection for the next step. What's the next step for Brazil to include these people that we have enforced, that is important to put in the social protection safety. But on the other hand, we have difficulties to finance this new program. But it was important that's the discussion in Brazil right now. We are discussing in a constitutional amendment to put this new safety program protection in the constitution, and how to finance this new overall or abroad protection for the people. That's the point that we are tackling in Brazil. It's very difficult discussion under the Congress and Ministry of Finance and the government and Ministry of Citizen.
Muchísimas gracias, News, Fabiana. Alejandra.
Thank you very much, News and Fabiana. Alejandra from Chile. Thank you very much, Simone. No doubt one of the greatest challenges has been how to face the loss of income that has been very abrupt in the different countries. This is not only in our country, but in the whole world as a result of confinement and reduction of activity, the result of the health crisis we're facing. A gross downfall of the income, of course, has an impact on the tools we have designed. It has been an opportunity for Chile to improve our processes of identification of people who have the highest socioeconomic vulnerability, to understand that informal economy is very present. We have to think of recovery and as an opportunity to reintegrate. We see that the program to subsidize employment goes along those lines, but also bearing in mind that there's been a health recovery, an economic recovery, and of course, the health part of it is changing from week to week. In that case, our country has been measuring, facing the challenge of reincorporation, reintegration, understanding that it has to do with the health aspect, but then the protection of income and the quality of the life of the people is essential. So we have to improve the processes of identification, and that tool should continue working and to become more efficient, more timely in a stage. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you very much. Laura Pavon from Colombia. Thank you very much. I think that the crisis showed two things. One is section that we had foreseen in the year 2002. We faced a crisis with 30% of the population in poverty and 40% of the population in vulnerable conditions. We have 70% of the population in poverty and economic vulnerability. We had not made progress in the consolidation of the middle class, which was expected from us from 2000 to 2020. So the great challenge is to consolidate those columns that whether contributive or non-contributive. And the second challenge is regarding information. Our databases are still have very low quality. They are not dynamic databases. They are not being updated, showing the changes in living conditions as quickly as to allow us to make decisions regarding the challenges. I believe that to recover, to attain the recovery of the income of the households and the deaccumulation of human capital, mainly in households and the children in learning. These are very, very important challenges we have to face, and something which is also very important apart from having the package of social aid. We're working on a strategy to reach those measures to give support to vulnerable families. We also have to to implement another package measures that we still need that we have to implement in the second stage of recovery that we will begin within the coming months. Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. That's very important. We don't want to have children and young people, new lost generation. Mr. Raul Romero, Guatemala. In the case of Guatemala, I think that the main challenges have been first to understand the social protection and the development programs must not be mechanisms of a reaction, of a response. Social programs must not be understood as an end in themselves. They are a tool of a state policy, strengthening the institutionality of social protection, generating a system that allows for a vision of short-term, mid-term, and long-term objectives that states are prepared to face different circumstances. Social protection must not be the result of a crisis, of an emergency. Social protection must be the result of the awareness of the state to generate equality conditions and possibilities of opportunity to every citizen. Social protection must be conceived much beyond a reaction. It must be a permanent policy to guarantee that the governments and the states keep the objective of getting prosperity, development, equality, and then there will be democratic governance in any state. If the COVID-19 crisis taught us something, that it showed the vulnerability of every state. Those states that were first world states were overcome by the crisis, that we could see that there were no health protection systems that were strong enough. In some cases, like in Guatemala, non-existent, and that showed that the impact, the shock of COVID-19 was greater in many countries, above all Latin America. I think that the new thing is, or that the governments and the officials of the countries become aware that the social protection is an ethical obligation of the government if they are going to comply with the objectives for which they were elected, and that this becomes social peace and democracy and peace in the world. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. We couldn't have finished with a better message than the words of the Guatemalan minister about the significance of a true permanent system of social protection and a message of peace. I'd like to thank everybody. It's been most enriching. I'd like to thank the 130 participants who have joined this mission. And now I'd just like to give the floor to Joseph.
So thank you so much. I think this was a very, very interesting session, and you all deserve a coffee break. However, I wanted to mention that there will be a small survey in the chat. There will be a link shared with you. So if you can fill out a small survey about how you like that session, we are most appreciative. So before we're gonna break for coffee, I wanted to tell you that there are some very interesting things ahead of us. So you should not leave us, but actually stay with us for another hour or so. So first of all, we are going to have the open peer-to-peer dialogue after the coffee break. This is the time where you can actually exchange your country experiences, your lessons learned, your thoughts about the way forward, and you can either choose to do it in English or in Spanish. We are going to break into groups of approximately 10 people. You're gonna meet your peers and can have a deep dive into a conversation on social protection. So stay with us. The coffee break will be approximately 15 minutes. The first 5 minutes will be actually for refreshing yourself. And then the last 10 minutes, we are going to have a South African magic champion, and he will share some very interesting illusions with you, or maybe it's even real magic. It looks like real magic. So we add some magic into your life, and I'm going to introduce him when he's coming up after a 5-minute coffee or tea break. So let's stop it here for the moment. I see you back in 5 minutes, and when you hear my voice, then we are about to start with a magic show, and in about 15 minutes with a peer-to-peer dialogue. So thank you very much, and see you in a very short while. So last but not least, I promised you a preview of our graphic recording achievements so far. Our graphic recorder, Sonia, has been working the whole day from early morning to, well, it's always morning. Every session is every morning, depending on the time zone, but from Asian morning to Asian evening. And so she started, I think, 5 o'clock her time in South Africa. And this is a very beautiful preview. It looks already very complete, Sonia. Are you still working a little bit more on it? So I hope that.
Yeah,
that
I unmuted myself. It's finished, and I'm just going to re-photograph it in the morning when the light's good. But it's complete.
Okay, so our colleagues from socialprotection.org will share it with everybody. It looks fantastic, and I think a lot of interesting thoughts there. Everybody would like to read again, and congrats to you, Sonia. really a great achievement. And every time I see this many very praising comments in the chat box. So we are coming to the final wrap up. And so we heard a lot of interesting things from our speakers in the regional session on Latin America and Caribbean. We had 2 colleagues from IPCIG sharing their mapping work, as well as 4 speakers from Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Guatemala. Maybe let me highlight just 2-3 points. So Brazil, we heard the largest city of Brazil's history showed the need for inclusive technology to reach the most vulnerable, as well as the importance of a strong existing single registry. That was a message I take away from Brazil. From Chile, we have a set of responses tailored to the needs of different population groups. Chile also has shown us that there are synergies between the responses to the crisis and the 2030 SDG agenda. That's a takeaway from Chile. Colombia, first time the country implemented an unconditional cash transfer, which amongst other helped to increase financial inclusion. And now Colombia is also making advancements in terms of its social registry, a key feature, as we all know, for social protection systems. And last but not least, the Honorable Minister of Guatemala, he has also had a set of different programs depending on people's need with thorough eligibility criteria. Finally, the minister emphasized government's obligation to implement strong social protection systems, not only as an ad hoc response. So these were messages from our country examples. And before we call it a day, and many of you are, I think, waiting for lunch, maybe a quick outlook to the future, but the intermediate future. Tomorrow, we have a fantastic menu for you. I hope many of you have signed up. We have the clinics. This is a session where you can receive tailored advice on specific practical questions. And they are held in different time zones. So of course, there are also several sessions available in the Latin American Caribbean time zones. We have the roundtables where a group of experts discuss a specific topic, and you can also engage with them through Q&A. And last but not least, we have the virtual booth or the virtual expo, and we have virtual booth talks where specific experts of different organizations sharing their flagship approaches, their flagship products, and you can ask them all the questions you want. They are in their virtual booth at a specific time. So if you haven't looked at the program in that regard, you should go to socialprotection.org, log into the conference program, and you can actually schedule your own customized program. On October 7th, we have 9 different side events. So check out the program. I think there's something for everybody. These are hosted by different key stakeholders working on social protection. I think there are really a number of interesting events happening. And last but not least, last day, we will take stock on what we have discussed so far. We're going to have 2 expert panels, one on the implications of the COVID-19 crisis for the future of adaptive and shock responsive social protection, and also an expert panel on the implications of the COVID-19 crisis for universal social protection, as well as some people who share insights on their way forward. So that's on the menu for you in the next 3 days. So we hope that many of you will be able to join and make use of this fantastic program. Again, we invite you to also make use of our self-reflection and show your commitments. And with the last view on this beautiful picture, I think I want to call it a day. So thank you so much for joining us. The whole team thanks you. There's a whole team working in the back to make this global e-conference happen. Share your thoughts and experience on social media. We have a hashtag, what's next for social protection. So hashtag what's next for SP to be precise. You can share on all the usual social media channels. So stay safe, stay healthy, and let's make social protection for all a reality. So I wish you a good day from Asia. So here is already past midnight. So for me, it's the end of the day. For you, I wish you a very well-tasting lunch and a good afternoon. Bye-bye for now. And thank you, Dr. Richard, for joining all 3 sessions.